So we're going to dive in to the conversation. I know that there will be various courses of dinner served throughout the conversation. So please fill your bellies as you also fill your minds with the expert speakers that we have here today. My name is Manpreet Singh Anand, and I guess I'm representing a couple of different organizations today. The U.S. National Defense University, where I serve as an adjunct professor, but also I have an affiliation with the Center for New American Security, of which I'm very proud of which Dan Kliman is also a part of, which we'll get to in a minute. This is the session on curating a new concert, multiple visions for the future of the Indo-Pacific. And I can tell from the turnout that this is a popular topic here at Raisina 2019. In this evening's conversation, we're going to really delve into what are the, I think, evolving power dynamics throughout the Indo-Pacific region. And for those of you that have been attending the other sessions here at Raisina, you know that this has been a common theme throughout this year's dialogue. And I think it's a common theme because we're all trying to still make sense of what this reorder across the globe really means. And perhaps nowhere in this kind of world reorder dynamic is more pressing than, frankly, in the Indo-Pacific region. This is an issue that is trying to describe how countries and economies and private actors are trying to respond and have impact in a region that, frankly, has endured in terms of having a path towards peace and prosperity and freedom. And so the conflicts and the changing dynamics that we're seeing now really could threaten some of those, what I think have been enduring trends in recent history. And I think that's what this panel is really going to come to grips with and try to talk about. So some of the questions we're going to delve into include, first, what are some of the competing visions for the Indo-Pacific? What are the competing economic strategies that are being deployed throughout this region? And importantly, especially for me, given my passion around development, given the tremendous development needs that are required throughout the Indo-Pacific, how can we make sure that the strategies that are being deployed are ones in which investments are sustainable, respecting the environmental and social and governance standards that we know are required for sustainability? And so ultimately, do these different visions work in concert or create some type of cacophony? And I think that's really what this panel is meant to describe. Fortunately, we have a wonderful panel of experts here to help us think through these issues. To my right, we have Ms. Ruta Maluta, a member of parliament from Lithuania. We have Daniel Kliman, a senior fellow with the Center for New American Security. To his right, we have Dr. Li, a senior fellow at Tsinghua University. And finally, we have Dr. Alicia Garcia Herrero, a senior fellow at Bruegel, which is a think tank out of Brussels. And so I'm anxious to hear from each of them. But before I do, just one additional comment. I want to draw your attention to a report that the Center for New American Security recently released. It's called Power Play, Addressing China's Belt and Road Strategy. And this was co-authored by Daniel Kliman here on the dais, as well as Abigail Grace from the Center for New American Security. It's a report that focuses on how the Belt and Road Initiative seeks to reshape the world and the impact that it could have throughout the Indo-Pacific, so very timely for this conversation. And I have to say that, and I'm being a bit biased here because I had a small part in providing a little bit of input to this report, but I think it does an amazing job of providing some really sound recommendations for both policymakers and policy thinkers in the areas of geopolitics, commerce, and governance and development. And so I highly recommend you take a look at this piece. It's available on the net at cnas.org. Again, it's Power Play, Addressing China's Belt and Road Strategy. A simple Google search will get you there. And in the interest of sustainability, we didn't come prepared with a lot of paper reports, so I encourage you to go and find it online. Now I'll ask each of the panelists to provide some brief opening remarks, maybe 5 to 7 minutes of opening remarks on this topic, and then we'll circle back around for a Q&A from the audience before concluding the session at 9:30. So we'll just go right down the line. So Ruta, if you don't mind beginning.
Thank you, Mr. Anand. Good evening, dear ladies and gentlemen. Honored to be here among the experts of the topic. As I was introduced, I'm a member of Parliament of Lithuania, so I will try to speak more from a European perspective towards Indo-Pacific concept. Thinking about looking for cooperation for mutual interest, I cannot avoid bringing up the example of European Union, which I believe is a very successful example. The founders of EU were aspiring to build a peaceful, prosperous and united Europe, and more than 60 years later, Europe is still living in peace, and the period is longer than ever. It hasn't been so peaceful in the last 2,000 years, so thanks to European Union, one of the goals were aspired. And what is more, 28 member states of the EU altogether, they make the second largest economy in the world with 508 million EU citizens. It's a little bit less than 7% of the world population. It's less than India's population. But European Union's GDP last year made 22% of the global economy, which I think is pretty amazing. And it clearly shows that united countries could achieve much more rather than being single on their own. And I'm very glad that Lithuania also chose the European path more than almost 30 years ago after regaining independency from the Soviet occupation. Lithuania has decided to choose the Western-oriented foreign policy, and now it's almost 15 years since Lithuania is a member of EU. And has benefited a lot from the single market and benefit a lot from the free movement of goods, services, capital and labor. And being a member of the EU, we also benefit in a way that we have good deals and reach bigger markets. Also, the new strategy between the European Union and India is beneficial for each country. Would it be Germany, France, or Lithuania, the country where I come from, with 3 million citizens, we are a part of one of the biggest global economies. So being a member of a bigger group can benefit in many ways. But coming back to the topic of Indo-Pacific, we heard that it's supported by Japan, by Australia, by United States, by India, but it's also strongly supported by European Union as well. And also India's political leadership in the Indo-Pacific concept is supported. And not only because European Union and India has a common interest in each other's prosperity due to investment, but also I think it's very important that European Union and India shares common values such as fundamental human rights and democracy and human rights. It also supports global order based on rules and centered on multilateralism. And talking about the reasons why it is so, I would like to rely on one expert from Vilnius University who was explaining about the emerging powers, and he gave an example. Russia could be also considered an emerging power, but their power is based on military capabilities mostly. And I believe that Russia's aggression toward Ukraine and Georgia clearly shows that. It was also a lot discussed today about China's economical power, and I'm very glad that here today at the panel we also have a representative who can speak about China more in depth. So we are not speaking behind the eyes. But the current EU and China relationship, I think, could be explained in a joke, which was as a headline that China and EU performs a tricky diplomatic dance. On one hand, the diplomatic relations, they have a long history, but on the other hand, it's clear that it's raising many questions and new issues. So therefore, I see why European Union is to invest much more into relations with India. And talking about the Indo-Pacific concept for the future, I do have doubts, especially if it's going to be successfully institutionalized, because there are still questions whether the countries have the needed synergy, and if countries for the region do agree on the key principles. And we can see that some of the countries are being left out. For example, South Korea is not participating much, Philippines. So therefore, many questions still has to be answered. That would be my short comments, and we'll be looking forward to hearing questions.
Thank you, Ruta. I think thinking about the EU as a concept and the institution of the EU and how that has fostered so much peace and prosperity in that part of the world is a good backdrop into thinking about the concept of the Indo-Pacific. And I think you hit the nail on the head about questions around institutions and what that means. Perhaps that's why there's been so much focus on the Quad with respect to this part of the world. But with that, can I turn now to Dan Kliman?
Great. Thank you, Manpreet. And I also want to thank the organizers for a superbly organized conference who even saw fit to feed us, the panelists, before the dinner began, which typically the panelists up here are starving while you eat, and it's very tough for us to watch. So with that, I want to start by looking at the title of this session, which very much acknowledges the lack of a single universally accepted vision for the Indo-Pacific. In reality, I would argue there are two contending visions. The first is a free, open, and inclusive Indo-Pacific in which the prevailing order that has backstopped peace, prosperity, and freedom endures. The second vision is very different. It's a vision of a regional order defined by great power spheres of influence, rigged economic interactions, and the spread of creeping authoritarianism. The first of these visions has many adherents. As you all, of course, know, the United States, under the Trump administration, has promoted a free and open Indo-Pacific. In practice, this concept translates into a regional future in which countries can interact without fear of coercion, fly, sail, and operate wherever international law affords, and trade and invest in fair and reciprocal ways. In this future, good governance in the region becomes more entrenched, and respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity endures. Turning to India, Prime Minister Modi has advanced a similar vision, one which he has encapsulated as a free, open, and inclusive Indo-Pacific. Japan was actually the first to use this term way back in 2016. So Prime Minister Abe actually was the one to coin free and open. And then lastly, Australia too has endorsed this concept. In Southeast Asia, to be fair, countries have not endorsed the concept or vision of a free and open Indo-Pacific, in part due to concerns about antagonizing China and questions about the centrality of their region in this framework. At the same time, though, no country in Southeast Asia has come out in opposition to a free and open Indo-Pacific, and some countries like Vietnam appear to quietly support it. So within the Indo-Pacific, really, there is only one country, China, that presents a serious alternative to a free and open vision. Beyond voicing a general desire for a diminished US role in regional security architecture, China has yet to articulate a clear or concrete vision for the Indo-Pacific. That said, actions speak larger than words. And through its actions, Beijing has made clear its desire for a future regional order which differs sharply from what endures today. Its actions include things like leveraging economic coercion to shape the behavior of countries that have choices that do not always align with its interests, pursuing economic relationships that create debt, dependence, and leverage. Domestically, Beijing has also strengthened its social controls online and off, essentially becoming more authoritarian, and also engaged in mass detention of ethnic Uyghurs. Abroad, China has exported elements of its domestic surveillance regime as its information technologies go global. And then lastly, China has attempted to covertly influence the domestic politics of democracies in the region, such as Australia and more recently Taiwan. Given these two contending visions, in my view, a regional concert is unlikely to emerge in the near future. At the same time, cooperation will not replace competition, but competition need not lead to actual conflict. In my view, actually, competition can actually be virtuous, at least in the economic domain, where efforts by the United States, India, Japan, and Australia to advance their vision can actually benefit all, including China. The contest over infrastructure in the Indo-Pacific is illustrative of this dynamic, what I would call virtuous competition. In 2013, President Xi unveiled what has since become known as the Belt and Road, essentially Beijing's vision for a more connected world brought together by a web of Chinese infrastructure. Although the need for infrastructure in the Indo-Pacific is certainly very real, the Belt and Road has also served to advance China's geopolitical position, all the while, at times, corroding international commercial standards and human rights and governance in recipient countries. Yet the challenge posed by Belt and Road has actually compelled the United States to take actions in response that on their own independent merits are beneficial both to the region in terms of promoting economic development and, of course, to American security and economic interests. So to go into a bit more detail on that, in the last 18 months, the United States has taken the following steps. It has moved for the first time to seriously resource economic alternatives in the Indo-Pacific. For example, in October 2018, Congress passed and the President signed legislation that will more than double America's development financing capacity to $60 billion. More recently, just last week, the President signed the Asia Reassurance Initiative Act, legislation that will allocate $1.5 billion per year over 5 years for activities in the region to support a rules-based international order. At the same time, the United States has moved to enhance cooperation with allies and partners in the economic domain in important ways. So, for example, the United States has concluded bilateral agreements with Japan and Australia for infrastructure financing, which has ultimately paved the way for trilateral cooperation. Third, the United States has invested in new tools to build capacity in the region. For example, in mid-2018, the United States launched a new transaction advisory fund to help, and I quote, partners access private legal and financial advisory services. Absent the challenge posed by China to a free and open Indo-Pacific, it's likely that the United States would never have actually taken many of these actions, even though they are, of course, beneficial to the region and the United States. And so in this sense, competition, in my view, can be virtuous. The United States is not alone in this. If you look at India's actions in its near abroad with infrastructure, Japan and Australia in the South Pacific, all have taken actions that ultimately, of course, advance their own interests but are promoting development. And I would argue these actions would not have occurred was there not an alternative vision on the table. So where do we go from here? Going forward, the future of the Indo-Pacific will remain very much contested between these two visions. China under Xi Jinping is unlikely to abandon its vision, though it may modify its tactics in response to temporary setbacks. In the United States, both major political parties are very much wedded to the current approach, although the name by which it's called will likely change. Countries like India, Japan, and Australia, too, appear committed to supporting a rules-based regional order. So, to be sure, China's vision for the Indo-Pacific has experienced setbacks in recent months, as a growing set of democracies question the nature of its investment and, at times, its influence in their domestic politics. But this is not the time for complacency. The United States and its allies and partners must do more. For example, by creating a digital development fund that would support information connectivity in the projects in the region that adhere to globally recognized norms of human rights and online privacy. So, to conclude, a concert of powers in the Indo-Pacific is unlikely to emerge, given these competing visions. But competition need not translate into conflict. We don't need to have competition as necessarily a bad thing. In fact, in democracies like the United States, India, and others, competition can motivate us to take actions both to our own benefit and to the benefit of many others as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Dan. And you know, I, for one, really appreciate how you teased out not just kind of this idea of two competing visions, but how that could yield to perhaps a more productive or virtuous, as you mentioned, output. And I think all of us are trying to look for those types of solutions, so I appreciate you teasing that out. Dr. Lee, if I could turn to you now.
Thank you. It's a great honor for me to be here and to share my personal views as a Chinese scholar on this important issue, actually, which already talked about during the day. China seems like elephant in the room, so now you have the elephant. No, definitely, I can just share with you my personal observation. So to answer this question, how to look at or how to view the future of the Indo-Pacific order, I think we have to answer two questions. I'm trying to answer two questions. The first one is, what is Indo-Pacific? The second one is, why Indo-Pacific? So what is Indo-Pacific? I think there's no consensus right now. I think, first some believe it is a region, including Asia-Pacific plus India. And some believe it's Indo-Pacific from plus the Indian Ocean region. And also, to some extent, Indo-Pacific is viewed as corresponding to Eurasia, with the former focuses more on maritime domain and the latter on continental domain. And also, there are many composite terminologies like Indo-Pacific strategy, Indo-Pacific region, Indo-Pacific diplomacy, and also maybe the Indo-Pacific concept. I mean, there are many different interpretations, when you choose which, terminology. So, and why Indo-Pacific? In my personal opinion, I think actually, when you treat Indo-Pacific as just a geographic region, it is there. I think it's, when we are talking about Indo-Pacific, it's a reflection of both the rise of China and India. In the past, we used the Asia-Pacific, which India is now included. And since China has more, economic presence in the IOR, so I think Indo-Pacific is really a, reflection of the rise of both China and India. And it is also reflection of the increasing interactions and connectivities and connections between Asia-Pacific and IOR. And this is a region, is the, is the major economic engine of the world, the world today, right? Including, leading or robust economies like India, China, Japan, South Korea, and also ASEAN countries. So I think this is the positive side of the Indo-Pacific concept. But when you look at in the geopolitical, perspective, it seems that a reflection of emerging great power competition. And it's also, there's also a risk of, this kind of great power competition turning into a, confrontation. So in my personal opinion, maybe the real challenge for the future order in this region is the, the risk of this kind of great power competition turning into a great power confrontation. And I think, according to my understanding, up to now, in China, for the Chinese government, there's no, formal or official, position statement on Indo-Pacific. I think it's very neutral. But for the academic community back in China, I think there's really some kind of concern, especially on the direction of that Quad. And also this kind of concerns I already, discussed, I think, during the sessions related, through the day. So in my opinion, I think maybe, how to ensure the Indo-Pacific order. And I think for China, it's definitely, it's in China's interest to keep this region, open, stable, and prosperous. It is definitely in the interest of China. So I think, in my opinion, how to keep this Indo-Pacific order, I think the first and the most is that there should be more accommodation and communication between the major powers in the region, and prevent that great power competition turning into confrontation and rivalry. So I think it's very important. And secondly, I think we should observe ASEAN's centrality in the regional cooperation, and ASEAN plus mechanisms should play a bigger role. And based on it, maybe a regional security architecture should be explored. And thirdly, I think regional economic cooperation and integration should be promoted. And also, I think there are many common challenges we should deal with, like the terrorism, climate change, and poverty, and also maybe another regional or global economic crisis, right? Yeah, so I think we are on the same boat, right? Yeah, and last but not the least, I think differences and disputes should be managed well and ensure a peaceful settlement. I think the peaceful settlement is the only choice. I just want to stop here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Lee. I gave a lot of food for thought there at the end with a number of different policy ideas and recommendations that I hope we get into in the Q&A. If I can now turn to Dr. Herrero for her comments.
Thank you very much. Well, I see that most people have finished their lunch, which means you're ready for questions, which means I'm standing between you and those questions that you may have already. So I'm going to be very brief. I thought what I could contribute, I've been living in Asia for a long time, especially in Hong Kong. And hearing this discussion, I thought I should start by basically trying to compare, because I do believe that this is indeed a reaction to a large extent to the Belt and Road Initiative, compare those initiatives, because we've not really heard much about that. And in that regard, I would also want to add that, yes, you are the elephant in the room, but there's one more elephant missing in this room, which is Japan. And I just have to recall once upon a time, before I moved to Hong Kong, I was doing research at the Bank of Japan on something that, in a way, to me, now that I hear you, kind of rings the bell, which was a project to figure whether it was too late already for Japan to play a central role in Southeast Asia, based on Monterey. At that time, ASEAN was discussing Monterey policy coordination, and in kind of probably a speech that would never be repeated anymore after what happened in Europe, eventually Monterey Union. So anyway, at that point, I was asked to write this report, and I thought, the result was basically the yen has no chance, okay? It was already already then, 96, Southeast Asia was much more integrated with China. So imagine today. What I'm saying is, okay, if that doesn't work, you move somewhere else. Yeah, you move somewhere else. You move south, you move over here. So I think that Japan has been seeing the rise of China, for so long. And of course, they have, the right standpoint to see that. And I think a lot of the closer strategies on the Indo-Pacific can relate to Japan's view of what was going to happen, which has actually happened. So that's the beginning. But I think what Japan never imagined, or at least not that I can relate to, is that because of our own crisis, by own I mean the US followed by Europe, China would end up having to create a massive excess supply. They didn't know it was in excess at the time. They were just building the supply, investment like crazy, for a world that was supposed to import all of that, and suddenly the world collapses. And I think the first thing, and this is my first reading of the BRI, was not about, to me, frankly speaking, geopolitics. It was about, what do I do with this excess supply? Yeah, and frankly, rightly so, because that was the time, and I used to write those reports of the emerging middle class, everywhere, including here. And I think China just said, let's switch consumer. These consumers are not there. Let's find other consumers for us. And I remember I wrote a piece for the Nikkei, something like, build now, pay later. And this brings to the point of debt and debt accumulation. By the way, China is not the only one lending rather than investing. We have here, somebody from Latin America. Latin American financial crisis in the 80s was just a lending channel of excess supply of dollars, both from the US, Japan, and the Middle East. So, I mean, China is not doing anything new. Or at least, I would rephrase that. China was not doing anything new at the beginning of what was the BRI, to me, vision, which was markets. And to get markets, I need to have new routes, because the existing routes are not controlled by me, and I'm the largest exporter in the world. So, rightly so, I would have done exactly the same thing, frankly speaking. Now, the world, though, reacts to that, rightly so. I mean, again, this is just the nature of where everybody is. China was not the hegemon. To me, it isn't yet. And thus, the hegemon obviously saw what was happening. And, this is the reaction we see. And part of that reaction, instrumentally, both for Japan, in a way for India, and certainly for the US, is the Indo-Pacific. I mean, I just can't think of any other reason. Now, if I were China, and this is kind of game theory, sorry, I'm an economist, I hope you've realized by now. As a reaction, I guess if I were China, I would say, wait a minute, do they feel I'm threatening? Maybe I also feel threatened because they feel I'm threatening. It's like, so the whole project becomes very different. I'm abstracting here from the regime, from all of the different words that would, respect for sovereignty, free and open seaways, transparent, this is Indo-Pacific, yeah? Transparent financing of infrastructure. It's like the mirror opposite of how we describe BRI. So okay, I'm going to abstract for a minute of the fact, and I would agree with that BRI might not be, frankly speaking, market-driven. It's a hub-and-spoke approach to building things that you need for you to export, and eventually, if the world reacts to you, for soft power, and eventually, if the world reacts to you, for hard power. But in a way, I think this is the way, it's not like, frankly speaking, maybe today, after, many, many years, 5 years already since the very first announcement, we can argue that all of this was planned this way. I disagree with that. I think this was China's kind of different responses to different problems China was facing. The first was excess capacity. I have no doubt about this. And then China felt, wow, we're strong. We're doing all of this. The world is reacting possibly, no more. By the way, we wrote a piece at Bruegel with big data looking at China's image in the world through the Belt and Road concept. I hope I can do that with the Indo-Pacific one day and present it here, but not yet. So BRI, interestingly, has a more negative image in countries which belong to BRI. I can give you an example. Europe is, the worst image is in Serbia and Poland. The best image is in the Netherlands. So, you know, it's like, wait a minute, how come? So I may argue that maybe because of that switch from economics to soft and eventually maybe hard power, it's actually boomerang, I would argue, or maybe we are helping that to happen because we're building, you know, kind of, we're building platforms, the Indo-Pacific being one, that offers opportunities to those countries that have been approached by China. So they may say, wait a minute, who's giving more? Yeah, who's giving more? I have a choice. So they may be rethinking their you know, how much they were engaged, how much they like this strategy. So in other words, I think it's much more dynamic than we actually describe it, both strategies. And I have no doubt, having lived in Hong Kong for many years, that China is going to react again to this boomerang. They are probably going to realize that having this, you know, state-driven approach to BRI is not working. And maybe they will open up. Open up, I don't mean China itself. We could discuss that. I have my strong views about that. But I mean the actual BRI strategy. And we hear it from Japan. They're going to JBIC for, you know, to share contracts. They're coming to Europe quite insistently that they want to see joint projects, you know. So I would not be so, like, you know, black and white. And I think this is important for India to realize that maybe taking one side only might not be the best strategy in this very complicated world. So I leave it here. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that. It's not often that we get to introduce some game theory into these kinds of conversations, so I appreciate you doing that. All too often, especially, I can speak from my prior experience in government, we don't take into account how dynamic sometimes these reactions and counter-reactions can be when devising our own policies. And so I think it's important to keep all of that in the back of our minds. We're going to now move to the Q&A portion of this panel discussion. Each of the tables have a microphone on it. I will try to collect maybe 2 or 3 questions at a time and then have each of the panelists respond to them. When asking a question, if you could please identify yourself and your affiliation and keep the question brief and to the point if you don't mind. We don't have a whole lot of time. So I saw the gentleman right here in the front. If we could start here and then we'll move our way back.
My name is Aishan Shu. I'm with Johns Hopkins University. My question is, now we've been mainly talking about China as a state actor having a vision for the Indo-Pacific region, but let's pause for a moment and talk about the non-state actors. We're talking about China setting also economic agenda to connect the region, but there are a lot of non-state economic actors. China has this immensely big gravitational force drawing the economic entities around it, and there are a lot of private investors that are going to Southeast Asian countries, that are going to various countries along the proposed maritime route, and to set up trade, to set up manufacturing, to bring the economies closer together, and to also integrate a lot of these economies into the Chinese supply chain. That's a big part of the international supply chain. So when we talk about a response from the West, the open vision of Indo-Pacific, to what extent do we address that issue? Now, governments can spend money on strategies, on infrastructure, but what solutions do we have to boost the connection of economies that are not geographically close to each other and do not naturally draw very close to each other like they would otherwise towards the Chinese economy?
Okay, thank you very much. Gentlemen on that, yep.
Well, thank you very much. My name is Ram from China. I'd like to, I have observation, a comment, and also a question. My comment
if
is
you could
that
keep it to the question, I appreciate it, just so that we can
very
have
briefly, very briefly. I think there has been a lot of talk about Indo-Pacific, the challenge, the threat, all sort of thing. But from my perspective, the most imminent or theory threat will be creating the division in Indo-Pacific, in the region. So my question actually is ask the panelists that do you see any kind of a possibility that this Indo-Pacific could be divided by artificially and create the so-called competing vision? And number one, for example, very often mentioned about a Quad. Well, on one hand, there are 4 nation Quad. On the other hand, you articulate it's a free, open, inclusive. However, when you say Quad, it's just limited to 4 nations. It's not open, it's not free, it's not inclusive. So it is the self-conflicting issues. So my question really is there kind of a potential that to create the division? And the theory thing is about in Indo-Pacific is to, I think the most important thing should be the connectivity rather than to build the wall in this region. Thank you.
Thank you. Yep. Jeff, if you want to.
Thank you very much. Jeff Payne, National Defense University in Washington, D.C. Questions for everyone on the panel, but specifically Dr. Lee, if you could answer. You mentioned accommodation between great powers. And taking a cynical point of view to what you said, in what way have other great powers not accommodated China thus far? I want to know more about your thoughts on this. I mean, besides things like the South China Sea and East China Sea, on a global stage, the world has been, by and large, pretty accommodating to China vis-a-vis other rising powers. So I'd just like to see your reaction to that. Thank you very much.
Great. Let's take these 3 and have the panelists respond to them, and then we'll come back for another round. If we can maybe just go in reverse order and respond to the questions that you think you would like to.
Yeah, maybe very briefly. Just
the
the
mic, please.
Sorry. Last question. I think the world has been very accommodating to China's economic rise until they realized that China could become the largest economic and maybe one day political power in the world. That's as much as we could accommodate. Rightly so, but this is the reality of things. And maybe we realized too late, according to our understanding of where things should be. So once we felt that the status quo could be challenged, that's when we reacted. So, but this is economic accommodation that we've been performing.
Great. Dr. Lee, if you wouldn't mind responding to that last question, but also the first question about non-state actors as well.
Okay, yeah, I will try my best. I think, first of all, I would like to, make some points of on BRI. BRI, I think, including, I'm trying to answer your question through this perspective. I think there must be many misunderstandings of the BRI. I think first, BRI, I think is not a strategy. Definitely, I totally agree with you. It's a kind of continuity of the Chinese, enterprise or the Chinese businessmen, going abroad. I think many mega projects were there. I mean, before the BRI, right? Yeah. So I think it's a kind of, the Chinese, for some economic considerations. But I agree with you that they have some kind of strategic consequences, which maybe China itself didn't expect. Secondly, I think it's not BRI. Definitely, is not China's project. I think the Chinese, leadership make it very clear that it's a platform for international corporations, including bilateral cooperation and multilateral cooperation. And thirdly, I think for some, countries, including our partners along the, BRI, I think there's a kind of too high expectation. They think that BRI should be a panacea, which is definitely not. For those countries who suffers from some economic difficulties, how to improve or have a kind of a sustainable growth is the solution, is their structural economic reform, not the BRI. So what I want to mean, my point is that BRI cannot solve all the problems, for those countries who are our partners. And to answer your question, I think you mentioned the South China Sea or the great power accommodation, right? So my point is that in my mind, the great power competition or the confrontation is most happened between China and the U.S. As mentioned by panelists during the day, there are a lot of concerns about emerging new Cold War, right? So I think to some extent, this Indo-Pacific, especially the Indo-Pacific strategy, happened, at this background. So I really doubt, the future, the challenge for the future order in the region is the threat of the rise of China or the perception of, making China be a threat. Thank you so much.
All right, I'll answer two of the questions. On the kind of non-state Chinese actors, I think from a US perspective and probably that of many other countries, the issue is really, are companies playing by international rules of the road when they go in, and what is the degree of state influence? So if you're looking at Chinese state-owned state-owned enterprises themselves, or many large Chinese companies that ultimately do have ties back to the government, there are a lot of concerns. If there are kind of genuine companies that are not attached to the state going in, playing by kind of market rules, engaging in business practices that are internationally compliant, that certainly I think is a good thing generally. In terms of the dividing up the Indo-Pacific and the Quad, I do want to make one point, which I've heard a lot about the Quad today. In reality, I mean, the Quad is kind of the tip of the iceberg in collaboration. I would argue what's much more meaningful is these democracies that participate all have robust trilaterals and bilaterals among each other. And more generally, the Quad is one of many, many different groupings and organizations that are all hopefully advancing a kind of free and open vision for an Indo-Pacific. And so I don't think it's fair to sort of take the Quad and say it's not inclusive, because at the end of the day, it is not, should not be the central thrust of a free and open Indo-Pacific. And I think from an American perspective, it's not, even if sometimes there's a temptation by media or others to make it that way.
Yeah, just to underscore that last point, I think that was really well done, but we should think about the Quad not as a construct unto itself, but the principles that bind those countries together, and it doesn't have to be just the Quad. There are a multitude of countries that have those principles. Ruta.
Very shortly about the non-state actors. I actually agree what Daniel was saying about them, and also would like to drag the attention about the state actors, that not all of the countries from ASEAN region, they have showed their interest. For example, Philippines and Cambodia, they were most reluctant, and we also see that Laos, Brunei, and Myanmar are completely silent as well. Indonesia, Vietnam, Thailand, Singapore, these are the countries that should also have a stronger voice, because in the end it's not only the question, the issues important for the bigger players, but also for the smaller. So I believe this should be also kept in mind in the future.
Thank you. Okay, there was a hand in the back we'll take a couple more before concluding.
Now it's better, okay. My name is Patrick Kukiel. I'm from the Polish Institute of International Affairs in Warsaw. Since Poland has been mentioned by Alicia already, I feel I need to do small clarification. There is no a single project realized by China under BRI in Poland. And from my educated guess, the attitude towards BRI is actually rather positive. So I just would like to challenge maybe the findings. And my question goes to Daniel Kliman. Actually, I'm very glad and appreciate that you brought some numbers, resources, and funds and initiatives that the United States is going to invest in the region. But even if we add all this money together, it will be still much less than what is offered by China to the countries in the region. So my question is, do you think it's reliable to come on strategy on the part of the US to compete with China on the chip? Or maybe we need to invest even more resources into the region in order to compete, to be successful in this competition. And secondly, very short, I know Kliman, Daniel Kliman, you promoted the concept of the India as a global swing state a couple of years ago. And recently, the last three or 2 years, India joined the very engaged heavily with US and others in the Indo-Pacific and also re-engaged in Quad. So the question is, does it mean that India has already made up its mind and took sides, and it took the side with the US, with the West, with democracies, on the side of the current international order? And is India a swing state, global swing state still, or it's not anymore? Thank you.
Thank you. Richard?
Thank you. Richard Fontaine with the Center for a New American Security. Working? Yeah. If it's working. Okay, great. Richard Fontaine, Center for New American Security. Two really quick questions. The first is for Dr. Lee. If I understood your comment about BRI's strategic impact correctly, BRI was not designed with strategic intent. It was, sort of Chinese business opportunities, but that there have been strategic effects. And if that's right, if I heard you right, how would you assess those effects thus far? How successful has BRI been so far in sort of meeting China's strategic interests? And then second question for Dan, and actually for Manpreet too, if you don't mind, which is, Japan calls for a free and open Indo-Pacific, the US calls for free and open Indo-Pacific, India calls for the same thing. What do they all mean by that? And do they mean the same thing?
Great. Okay, one final question, then we're going to have to wrap up.
Yeah, good evening. My name is Commodore Watson from Chennai Center for China Studies and the National Maritime Foundation. First of all, I must compliment Dr. Lee for bringing some kind of a balance. She, I think, brought out the positive dimensions of the Indo-Pacific. But there are a lot of questions that still need to be answered as far as BRI is concerned. 5 years down the line, it's very clear that it's half success, half failure, or whatever you want to say. There are more countries are opting out of BRI. They're looking at it with a greater degree of suspicion because of the debt trap, particularly in case of Sri Lanka and others. Malaysia is withdrawn. So how do you look at this? Because it does come in the way of your export requirements, your strategic ambitions, as was also brought up by the previous question. So I think there are a lot more questions than there are answers. And of course, in lighter vein, you did say when you started off that you're not the elephant in the room. So maybe in lighter vein, I'll call you the dragon in the room.
Okay, thank you. So what I'd like to do is ask each of the panelists to respond as they see fit to those questions. But I'm going to add one more thing, and then we'll wrap up, which is if you could also give us one takeaway from this dinner conversation that you're going to bring back. I think it's important for each of us to think about what is the one thing that I learned today that I think is important today that maybe I missed today that I'm going to think about a little bit more. So if you could add that to your responses to the questions, then we'll conclude after that. And Rita, we'll start with you and just go down the line.
So I will start with your question. I think the most important question that I had myself: how compatible are the strategic interests of all the actors who are playing in the region? And in fact, I would like to be much more optimistic, but what I hear is that everyone is much more concerned about their own needs rather than the common good, which I believe was the driving force for the success of European Union, because you have to be ready to share the burden, you have to be ready to invest, and you have to be ready to help the others in order to have a common benefit. But I think that it still takes time. We will see how it's going to be in the future. But unfortunately, I'm a bit pessimistic. And going out that it takes a lot of work to make it.
All right, so let me address the few questions that were posed to me on, is the U.S. strategy under-resourced? I mean, of course, you can always argue the U.S. should spend more and more, but I think that actually ignores the real fact that, one, a lot of the figures that China throws around are not necessarily accurate or overblown, that China may promise vast sums that it will invest and not deliver. And so you really want to take a hard look at what has China actually spent on Belt and Road, which is still admittedly significant. One independent assessment put it at about $340 billion between 2014 and 2017, both looking at construction and investment. But even taking that figure, when we talk about, let's say, U.S. development financing, $30 billion new dollars, that is really meant to bring the private sector in. So you want to multiply that by 5 or 10. This is not just 30 billion, but it's the private sector coming in and it's serving as a force multiplier. So in that sense, it's not just U.S. government money, but it's private sector money. And last, but definitely not least, we can't ignore U.S. allies and partners, that many allies, Japan first and foremost, but also India, Australia, even Europe now, are putting in their own resources at a government level into high-quality infrastructure. And so I think when you add this all up, it actually looks pretty impressive in total. India is a swing state. I'm impressed that somebody remembers a report that Richard Fontaine and I co-authored many years ago now, it feels like. I mean, I would argue in our kind of framing, we were talking about India swinging toward the rules-based international order or away, not toward the United States. I would definitely say my takeaway that India has very much swung toward the rules-based international order. It's no longer a swing state. We could have a longer discussion on how closely it will align with the US or not, but that actually is less relevant to this concept of India as, or what being a swing state in the past. So the other, in terms of what I learned from this, and if I'm missing a question, apologize, I can't read my own writing here.
No, I think you covered the ones that were directed towards you.
And so kind of the one takeaway I want to push on or just mention is...
Sorry, except for Richard's question about what's the definition of a free and open.
Yes, thank you. So I actually...
Rather put you on the spot than put me on the spot.
So I actually tried to answer that question before coming here. I went through and looked through various official statements by India, Japan, and the US and tried to line them up. And I would say there's a loose alignment that all three democracies believe in things like freedom of navigation, open economies, the spread of human rights and democracy. Beyond that, nobody's been that detailed. And so I would say there's a kind of a loose alignment, just if you look at the official documents, but nobody is sort of codified in like immense detail what this looks like. So a loose alignment, but you can't really say more than that. The last piece to press on is I think there is a bit of a misconception, and this is what I wanted to get at with the concept of virtuous competition, that if the United States and others are taking a more competitive approach toward China, it's a bad thing. I think when you look at on the economic side, certainly the competition can lead the US and others to do more development assistance, more activity here in the Indo-Pacific. That's a good thing. More generally, though, I would argue that although you may sometimes hear public concerns about more competition with China, it actually helps countries like Japan and India, that China is more likely to engage them on favorable terms when the US is taking a tougher line than if the US is sort of more accommodating, then actually it's India and Japan that will suffer. So I want to end there and just say I think overall competition, if it's done correctly, can be a good thing for the region.
Thank you. Dr. Li?
I think for China, according to my own understanding, the strategic interest is definitely the peace and development. So for BRI, I think at least, there are two, from the Chinese, perspective, there's two basic considerations. One, for many Chinese people, they think especially for the business or economic communities, they are, they treat BRI, a kind of opportunity, right? As I mentioned, going abroad. And second, I think it's also a Chinese response for the international community's call for China to, provide more public goods, So I think in this sense, yeah, I think BRI up to now make very important achievement. Definitely, there are also challenges, as I mentioned. So what I, my takeaway from this session, I think for better or for stable Indo-Pacific, and also a, there are more, Chinese contribution to the stability and growth in the region through BRI. I think there should be joint efforts. On the one hand, I think the international community, need to read China correctly. On the other hand, China also should make efforts to make others, read China correctly. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. So first, maybe a very quick response to the question on Poland. This is actually not my opinion. This is something called GDELT, which is a massive big data platform of news of every country in the world in 100 languages. Now, it so happens that news and media may reflect people's opinion and not necessarily your government's opinion, but I'm just saying, that's the way it is, and I leave it there. But on my takeaway and a few of the other questions, I think I wanted to clarify something, because I just didn't mean to say, whether I said it or not, I can't recall, that BRI was market-driven strategy. I don't think it is. But that doesn't mean in itself that it was not driven by economic factors at the beginning. It's because China's economy is also not, and this I know that is very controversial, but in my humble opinion, a market economy either. So it's only following the model. For better or worse, it works for certain things, it doesn't work for others. But in a way, I think the way the strategy started reflects the way China actually operates. We may like it or not. But I just wanted to clarify that to your dismay, maybe. But I wanted to be frank on how I see things. The one last thing I wanted to say on what I've been learning, or perhaps how I'm rephrasing my thinking about Indo-Pacific versus BRI, which might not have been very clear in my previous statement, is that BRI is a hub and spoke, very clearly. And it starts in what I call the wake of multilateralism. Maybe Trump was not yet there, but I think we were seeing signs already of where we were heading. Yeah, the world was starting to look more and more regional, and everybody was looking slightly more inward-looking. Then Trump comes, and the reality is what we all know. So China's hub-and-spoke approach, in a way, reflects the fact that if the world is not multilateral, I'm dealing with bilaterally with everybody I like within a framework. The Indo-Pacific, though, is neither, frankly, a multilateral endeavor. If it were, and I agree with the comment from our Chinese friend, you wouldn't have these very specific four countries out there. I mean, it could be much more open. It could be much more of a an engaging platform, or you may as well not have it at all and go back to the institutions that we are actually dismantling. So it's more of a club, but because there is no hub, or maybe some want to be a hub, but others don't like others to be a hub, etc., I think it's much more unstable. And this is the competition part that you were discussing. So just food for thought. I think this idea of no-multilateralism, hub and spoke versus kind of power struggle, who knows where we will end. But I think these are two different models with very different consequences. Thank you.
Thank you. I will just respond briefly to Richard's question. I think Daniel addressed it perfectly in saying that there's these loose affiliations of principles. I will say, I think there's something missing in talking about a free and open Indo-Pacific. And what I would add is that it needs to be a free, open, and sustainable Indo-Pacific. And what I mean by sustainable is having kind of a common set of standards, environmental, social, governance standards that all countries and multilateral institutions and other organizations abide by when making investments throughout the Indo-Pacific. I think this will increasingly be important for host countries of these kinds of investments, for them to feel secure about the kinds of investments that are being made out of foreign capital, so that we don't have instances like what we saw in Sri Lanka, for example, with these kind of debt for sovereignty swaps. So I think that's something that we should be thinking about when thinking about the definition of a free, open, and sustainable Indo-Pacific. My big takeaway from this session was that it really pays to have more gender parity on panels, and so I really want to applaud the organizers for the construction of this panel and providing for more gender parity across the whole Raisina Dialogue as well. Please join me in thanking the panelists for this conversation.